Okay, this is podcast number 1 for Standard 6.3. In Standard 6.3, we're going to be taking a look at feeding relationships within an ecosystem by looking at food webs. We're also going to describe other types of relationships that can exist, including predation, competition, different types of symbiosis, and that will be in the second podcast for 6.3. So for this standard, you will be able to construct a food web and identify all of the food chains that are in that web. You'll be able to distinguish between the different trophic levels that exist in a food web. You'll explain how energy gets transferred between the trophic levels. And then in the second podcast, you'll distinguish between 3 types of symbiotic relationships, and you will be able to describe the predator-prey relationship. And we'll also take a look at how competition for resources can influence how an ecosystem is shaped. Okay, so we're going to talk about different types of consumers and producers in this particular podcast, and we're going to take a look at the relationships that exist. All right, the main source of energy for all living things on Earth is the sun. So we know that we need the sun in order to, in order for our plants to be able to do photosynthesis and create food. That's also true for algae. And without that energy source coming from the sun, there would be no food available anywhere on Earth. So anytime that we talk about energy flow in ecosystems, it always starts with the sun. So it is our autotrophs or our producers that are able to use energy from their environment to make their own food. That is what an autotroph or a producer is. So organisms that can do this include plants and protists like algae. This is an algae. And there are also some bacteria that can make their own food. Most autotrophs do this by doing the process of photosynthesis, where they're going to use the energy from the sun to create food. Others are going to use chemicals to do the same thing. So let's just review photosynthesis again. Remember, this is a chemical process in which organisms are able to convert energy from the sun into high energy foods, mainly sugar. Okay, so this is where you would need sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. All of those things would go into the plant. And they would be used to make a fruit, which is storing the plant sugars, and also oxygen, which gets released as a waste. Okay, so this is going back to what we learned back in Standard 2.4. This entire process is incredibly important because the energy from the sun is being stored now in this strawberry in this picture, and that strawberry is now what can get eaten by animals so that they can get their energy. Now those animals and bacteria and mushrooms and stuff that need to consume food are called consumers. So these are organisms that are going to rely on other organisms for their food and energy. So they have to eat other things in order to get their energy. Okay. So here's some cows eating some grass. That's how they get their energy. And the grass is one of the main photosynthetic organisms on Earth. So their cows get a lot of energy directly from that grass. We get more energy when we eat vegetables than we do from eating other animals, and we'll take a look at why that is later. So the way that different heterotrophs can get their energy is either by doing cellular respiration or fermentation. In either of these processes, you're breaking down food in order to release energy. Okay, so again, we've talked about this before. We take in our organic compounds, the sugars and the fats and the proteins, and they're going to get broken down initially. They're going to do an initial split of like the sugar and make some ATP. And then remember, when oxygen is present, we do aerobic respiration, and when we do that process, we can get a total of 36 ATP made. When there is no oxygen, only 2 ATP get made. So this is why oxygen is an essential part of life. Organisms that tend to use fermentation are usually a lot smaller, so they don't need as much energy. But for something like us, we need a lot of oxygen because we need to be able to get a lot of energy from our food. So cellular respiration will do that process for us. There are several different types of consumers that can be found within an ecosystem. Herbivores are the types of organisms that are going to eat only plants. So you can kind of see that in the name herb. Cows, deer, insects, some birds, these are all herbivores. Okay, I always like this comment. It says, Carney was relieved by the discovery that rhinos are herbivores and not make Herb feel any better. Because his name is Herb and he's a herbivore. No, yeah, no. All right, anyway, so herbivores tend to eat only plants. That is different when you talk about a human that eats only plants. Humans are not herbivores. Our diet consists of both plants and animals, so we have a different category. Organisms that eat only meat are called carnivores. Lions, tigers, wolves, those are our carnivores. Okay. Whereas organisms that can eat both plants and meat, and that both of those things make up the major portion of their diet, those are called omnivores. So humans, bears, there's birds that fall into this category. These are all omnivores. A cockroach is considered an omnivore. A pig is an omnivore. And a lot of times omnivores also fall into the scavenger category, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat only meat, and omnivores will eat both. But we do have another category of consumers that we need to talk about, and those are our detritivores or scavengers. These are the things that are going to eat the dead stuff out there. And this category of consumer is incredibly important. These are things like vultures, coyotes, worms. When an organism dies, whether it be an animal or a plant or a mushroom, that thing has to get taken care of. It's got to get broken down. And so detritivores and scavengers are going to go and they're actually going to eat things that have already died. This is not what humans do. We eat fresh meat, whereas a scavenger eats decaying meat, and they're okay with eating the decaying meat. It doesn't hurt them. Whereas if we were to eat decaying meat, we would get very sick. So they're going to help to kind of get rid of the large amounts of debris that would exist after an organism dies. Then the decomposers come in, and the decomposers are going to actually break down that organic matter and return the nutrients back to the soil. So bacteria and fungus are these types of things where they're actually going to release chemicals, and they're going to almost like disintegrate what is left of the dead organism. And all of those chemicals will go right back into the soil, and then they can get used again. And the cycle will continue on. Decomposers are probably one of the most important parts of an ecosystem, because we have to get all of the nutrients back into the soil so that the next generation of plants can grow, and then there's food for the entire ecosystem. All right, so each of these different kinds of consumers is going to fall on a different trophic level within an ecosystem. Trophic means energy or nutrition. So a trophic level is each step that is found on a food chain or food web. So when you're looking at who is eating who, each level on there is considered a trophic level. So the first trophic level are always the producers. The producers are going to get their energy directly from the sun. So they're going to get all of the energy, and they're going to put that energy into food. So the first level always is producers. The second level we call primary consumers. Primary consumers will be either herbivores or omnivores, and because they have to be capable of eating the producers. So the second level are our primary consumers. They're going to be eating these producers. Okay. Our third level are our secondary consumers. Our secondary consumers are going to be eating the primary consumers, or they could be eating the producers if they're omnivores. Okay, so a lot of times the third level ones can fall on multiple trophic levels. So it depends on what specifically you're looking at. But our third level are the ones that are going to be eating third in line, and those are our secondary consumers, are the second consumers to eat. And then we have our fourth level, which are our tertiary consumers, and these would be your carnivores, scavengers, and decomposers. And if you go any higher than fourth, we just call them a higher order consumer, HOC for short. Higher order consumers, anything above the fourth level, and that's typically where you would just find your scavengers and decomposers at that point. We don't go much beyond 5 levels in most food webs because we're going to see when things eat something else, energy gets lost along the way. And if you're the last one to eat in a chain, you're not going to get very much energy. So let's take a look at that. So energy flow through feeding. Energy will only flow in an ecosystem in one direction. So it starts at the sun, it moves to the autotrophs, they're the next to get the energy, and then it's finally the heterotrophs that will get the energy. Okay, so the sun is giving all of its energy to the autotrophs. We're not autotrophs. We are always going to be at least third in line to that energy because we have to eat the autotrophs in order to get our energy. So we can look at this energy flow in a food chain. In a food chain is showing how energy is passed through an ecosystem. And this is going to show the transfer of energy by eating and being eaten. And this shows one possible feeding relationship that could exist in an entire ecosystem. There's lots and lots of different possible feeding relationships, but a food chain is going to show you one possible relationship by showing how energy is being transferred. So in this case, the direction of the arrow that we're going to be using when we do a food chain shows the direction of the energy flow. So if you look back up here, the sun is giving its energy to the autotroph, and then the autotroph is giving its energy to the heterotroph, so the arrow points towards the direction the energy is going. So this is a very simple food chain. So in this case, you can see the sun right here is transferring its energy to the bushes by doing photosynthesis. We typically don't include the sun. It's not a trophic level. It's implied that it's there, but for the purposes of showing the energy transfer, we have it here. So the sun is transferring its energy to the bush. So the arrow is pointing at the bush because the energy is going in that direction. The deer is going to receive energy from the bushes by eating them. So now the energy is being transferred from the bushes to the deer. And then the wolf is going to get its energy by eating the deer. So in this particular food chain that you're looking at, the wolf is the highest trophic level. So we have our producers, we have a primary consumer, and we have a secondary consumer. Tertiary consumer in this case would be either a scavenger or a decomposer once the wolf dies, because a wolf does not have a natural predator. There's nothing that really is going to go out and hunt it and eat it. It doesn't really work that way. Okay, so in this picture, though, we're seeing the arrow is pointing at where the energy is going. Okay, here's another example of that. So the sun is giving its energy to the grass. The grasshopper gets energy by eating the grass, so the energy goes in that direction. The snake eats the grasshopper, so it gets energy. The hawk eats the snake. Eventually, the hawk will die, and the decomposer will break it down and put nutrients back to the grass. Now, that could also happen. The decomposer could also get energy from the snake, and it could also get energy from the grasshopper, and it could get energy from the grass itself when the grass dies. So anytime any of these organisms die, the decomposer will come in and break it down, get a little bit of energy out of it, and put the nutrients back into the soil. Okay, here's just another one showing you the trophic levels listed. Okay, so here are your producers down at the bottom. So they're getting their energy directly from the sun. So if it's on land, we're talking about a plant. It could be something like phytoplankton. These are different kinds of protists and stuff that are in the ocean. Primary consumers eat the plant. Right? Your secondary consumers are going to eat the primary consumers, so they're getting their energy, so our energy is going in that direction. Okay? And up here we have our quaternary. Quaternary is one that we would typically call a higher order consumer up at that level. Quaternary means fourth, so they're the fourth to eat in that case. And you can see every time the arrow is going, this is saying this fish is giving its energy to that whale when it gets eaten by it. All right, so another way of looking at how energy is transferred within an ecosystem is through a food web. A food web is a network of all the different food chains in an ecosystem and how they are all linked together. So we know in an ecosystem, not just one thing is going to eat the grass. You might have several different things eating the grass. And so a food web will show you all the different things that eat the grass and then all the different things that eat those things. So it's kind of showing you the much more complex interactions that truly exist within an ecosystem. So here we've got a typical food web. Okay, so our producers in this case, we have an oak tree and we have some pine. Okay, so those are our main producers. And you can see like the pine borer is going to eat the pine, so it's going to get its energy from there. And then that golden crown kinglet is going to eat the pine borer. Okay, but there's multiple relationships within here. So if you look at the snake right in the middle, the snake is at the third trophic level because it's receiving energy from eating the bird, it can eat the mouse, and it could eat the salamander. So there's multiple things that this guy could eat. So a food web shows you the multiple different kinds of relationships that you could have and that could exist. So we'll do some practice with food webs in class. All right, so what the whole purpose of eating really is, aside from getting our nutrients, it's to get energy. We have to get energy in order to survive. Okay, so when we talk about energy, the first trophic level in an ecosystem always has the most energy. And the first trophic level in an ecosystem is always the producer. So the producer always has the most energy. Now, as energy gets transferred down a food chain, most of it, 90%, gets released into the atmosphere as heat. So that's going to go into the work of actually getting the food, digesting the food. That all takes energy to do that. And what's left for the organism that was eating it is about 10% that they can actually use in their body for cellular processes. The rest of it is going to get used either with capturing the food, like I said, digesting the food, preparing the food, whatever needs to happen. 90% of the energy goes into that, and only 10% is actually gained by the body. So whoever is the final consumer in a food web or food chain is going to get the least amount of energy, because every time the energy gets transferred, it's going to go down by 10% or go down by 90%. So we can look at this actually in an energy pyramid. Okay, so here we have our energy pyramid. So here's our producers, right? So they are at the bottom of the pyramid because they have the most energy. And then our pyramid gets smaller and smaller as we go up into our final consumers here. So energy stored by producers. Producers at the bottom get 100% of the energy. They're getting all of the energy from the sun. So we say they have 100% of the energy. Now, when the primary consumers are going to eat the producers, so the producers are going to give their energy to the primary consumers, they're only going to gain 10% energy. The rest of it is going to get lost through use. And so we typically will say that it gets lost as heat. But basically, you can think about it as if a lion has to go and chase something down, it's going to take a lot of energy to do that. So what it's chasing, it's only going to gain extra energy, so only 10% back. So the producers get eaten by the primary consumers. They are going to gain 10%. Now the secondary consumers, when they eat the primary consumers, so now the energy is going in that direction, they're only going to get 10% of 10%. So that's 1%. So your final consumers up here end up getting only 0.1%. And if you had another level, it's 0.10%. Or 0.01%, excuse me. So by the time you get to the very last organisms in a food chain, if they are a large organism, they have to eat a lot in order to gain enough energy. That's why typically decomposers are smaller organisms, like bacteria, that don't have a huge energy requirement. Your final consumers a lot of times will be in this, or your things like lions and tigers and things will be in either the secondary or final consumer level. Good. Remember, they still have to take a large amount of food in order to sustain themselves because they're only getting 1% of the original amount of energy that was available. Okay, so that's why we need a constant supply of food, and that is why we have to eat animals. So as humans, it's better for us to eat producers than it is to eat consumers like pigs and beef and chicken, because when we eat producers, we're getting 10% of the energy, but when we're eating meat, we're only getting 1%. So most of your diet should be consuming producers and not just consuming meat. In the next podcast, we're going to take a look at more relationships that exist between living things in an ecosystem.